Hello, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Amelia Koford, and I'm a librarian and assistant professor here at TLU. Today I'm going to be talking about fake news and filter bubbles navigating the information landscape. So although the terms fake news and filter bubbles are relatively new, the underlying concepts about how we evaluate trustworthiness of sources are things that librarians have been talking about for a long time. If you have any questions or comments about my talk, you can contact me. My contact information will be on a slide at the end of the presentation on email or Twitter, and also the sources I use will be on slides at the end. So on my talk today, I'll be telling you my perspective on fake news and filter bubbles, identifying some myths about them, and suggesting some things you can do to navigate the information landscape. So what is fake news? The term can mean very different things to different people. In its purest form, fake news would be stories that are completely fabricated, either to serve a political purpose, for monetary gain, or just a hoax for someone to see what they can get away with. So there were some totally made up stories during the recent US presidential election that spread on Facebook and social media. And a historical example of fake news would be yellow journalism in the 1890s. There's a much larger category of things that have a kernel of truth but are very slanted. So clickbait, really sensationalized headlines would fall in this category. And then the term has also been used just to dismiss any news story that the person doesn't agree with or doesn't like. So many possible meanings, but one common factor in all these meanings is a lack of agreement over what sources should be trusted to report with authority. In 2016, the New York Times said that we have experienced the breakdown of a shared public reality built upon widely accepted facts. There's some danger in sort of over-romanticizing this past where we all agreed on everything. There's always been lies and spin and propaganda, misinformation. But it's true that in this couple of decades after the rise of television in the US, before the rise of cable television, there was a time when everyone in the US basically agreed and trusted these 3 newscasts on network news. These days, by contrast, people get their news from a huge variety of TV channels and online sources. 2/3 of people get at least some of their news from social media, according to Pew. And the Pew Research Center in another study found that people on different sides of the political spectrum give completely different answers when asked which news sources are trustworthy and untrustworthy. So that brings us to the idea of the filter bubble. When websites like Facebook or Google show us more and more results that are similar to what we clicked on in the past, this can create an effect like being in a bubble, where we see stories that confirm our existing worldviews, and we don't see stories that challenge our worldviews. To see an illustration of this, there's a website called Blue Feed, Red Feed, where you can see what some of these liberal and conservative sources are putting onto social media. The concept to call that a filter bubble was introduced by Eli Pariser in 2011 through a book and a TED Talk. So when we see that groups of people might have wildly different opinions on a given issue or a given politician, it's not really surprising that they have those different opinions because they've gotten wildly different information from the sources they trust. And we can't blame this all on manipulative tech companies, because the desire to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing worldviews, information that confirms what we think we know, is a very common human tendency. And if you want to look into the psychological factors that relate to fake news and filter bubbles, some concepts you can research are confirmation bias, backfire effect, selective exposure theory, and lie repetition effect. So now I'll talk about some myths that I hear when people are discussing fake news and filter bubbles. The first one is that evaluating sources for trustworthiness is simple and clear-cut. So it really bothers me when I hear students say, or when I hear people say that students these days are so clueless or so lazy because they can't tell the difference between a credible story and a biased story, because it's actually not that easy of a thing to do. For example, there was a study from Stanford that said that 80% of the students in their sample couldn't tell the difference between an ad and a news story. But the ones they showed them, the ad looked just like the news story in the layout of the website, and the only difference was it said sponsored content. So we have to teach people and learn those little tricks like seeing sponsored content to have that media literacy. When we teach students to evaluate sources, we usually give a checklist like who's the author, when was it published, what might be the bias of the site, and those are good factors to use, but actually we're going beyond the checklist when we really do the evaluation. We're not just asking those questions, but we have background knowledge that's helping us answer them in an informed way. So there's an example from an author called Mike Caulfield about how people develop their trustworthiness radars over time and through knowledge of the domain. So he says there's a website that mentions the Illuminati. So for him, because he's read a lot of online news, he knows a lot about what he's kind of looking at, he sees the word Illuminati and he's like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory site. This isn't just a regular straight news site. But for a student who's not familiar with that term Illuminati or the conspiracy theories that surround it, Illuminati might just be another one of many unusual words they encounter in their academic career. So they don't really have the knowledge and context to evaluate that the same way a more seasoned news consumer would do. So just giving a checklist that says, look at the author, look at the date, look at the bias, might not be enough. Mike Caulfield's arguing that we need to teach students more explicitly practical things about different websites, advertisers, and fact-checking sites like Snopes and PolitiFact that he considers to be credible fact-checking sites where you can take a Facebook article and cross-check it. So the second myth I want to talk about is the myth that the media can't be trusted. You'll hear a lot of people say they just don't trust the media or they don't trust the mainstream media. And working at a university, I feel like I can play into this because I'm always saying, look for peer-reviewed scholarly articles, they're the gold standard, and don't look at the journalism about them because it might be, they might have gotten things wrong. But authority is different in different contexts. So the best way to learn about whether diet soda is healthy is to do peer-reviewed studies and go through the scientific method and go look at the actual studies. But the best way to learn about what happened yesterday in Syria is journalism. It's not the peer-reviewed scientific articles. In that context, journalism is the way we know things. Journalism is a professional field with high ethical standards. Journalists, they often risk their lives for stories. It's a really serious profession. According to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, journalists do things like double-checking facts with more than one source, holding powerful people accountable, balancing the public interest with the rights, for example, of criminal suspects, and acknowledging their mistakes. So those are some of the ethical standards that journalists are held to. And if someone fails to live up to those principles, they're not really doing good journalism, and writers who are employed by trustworthy news organizations will be held to those standards. So I'm talking here about original reporting, where a reporter gives a first-hand account of things they've learned through documents or interviews. And the tricky thing is not every talking head we see on a news channel necessarily is doing original news reporting or following those ethical standards. So learning those distinctions is an important part of media literacy. The last myth I want to talk about is that if everyone has a bias, that means nobody has the truth. So many scholars, including myself, believe that bias is inevitable, that there's no such thing as a reporter or a teacher or a librarian who's perfectly neutral and impartial. And this idea came from the postmodernist movement and from people who were saying, hey, all these institutions that are supposed to be neutral are actually just maintaining their power and oppressing some other people. So the idea of questioning everything and being skeptical about truth and authority, people can run with that and say, well, then if everything has a bias, then there's nothing that's true. This person says this person says this, it's all the same. But actually, truth, I believe, still can be sought. You can, I think, make the argument that no one can know the absolute truth, but humans have thought of a lot of great ways to get at the truth, and the scientific method is a really great one, and journalism is also a really great one. So from my perspective, we don't need to give up on truth and facts. Authority and credibility aren't just bestowed out of thin air onto powerful people, but authority and credibility can be gained through people who become an expert in their given field. So what can we do in a world of fake news and filter bubbles? We can develop our own trustworthiness radar by reading widely and investigating articles critically. If there's an article that makes you feel really strong emotions, really outraged or really panicked, step back and think about, the publisher and the advertiser might have had an interest, financial interest in making you feel those feelings, so don't necessarily just go with them. Look at it with a level head. And we can avoid demonizing people with different views. I would say try to find one source from a different political perspective that you feel like is really smart and you can trust, and set it to always show in your social media feeds. That's a way to kind of burst your filter bubble a little bit. When savvy news consumers go to a new website, the first thing they do is leave it. So if it's a new website, you haven't heard of it, you haven't seen the story they're reporting, see if it's being reported by other news sources, see if there's evidence that it might be a hoax or that it might be the only place reporting that story. And those credible fact-checking websites that I mentioned, Snopes, PolitiFact, and factcheck.org are considered credible fact-checking websites. So although today's information landscape can be difficult to navigate, it is also a wonderful place in many ways. Compared with the days when everyone watched the same 3 news channels, we have many more voices, we have much less potential for them to be, dominated by one idea, and power is distributed more widely. And we can safely trust a lot of those voices out there if we just take some time to be thoughtful and aware about them. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining me today.